The cruelest fairy tale isn't the one where Cinderella loses her glass slipper. It's the one where everyone decides she never deserved to wear it in the first place. By the time the crystal champagne glasses shattered across the marble floor, every pair of eyes in the ballroom was already looking at me like I was the mistake. But that wasn't where my night began. It began 6 hours earlier, when the alarm on my battered phone buzzed at 5:30 in the morning, pulling me out of another dream I couldn't afford to finish. My name is Emily Carter, I'm 24 years old, and if you had asked anyone who knew me that morning what my future looked like, they probably would have shrugged before saying something polite enough to hide the truth. I rented a tiny studio apartment on the edge of Queens where the radiator clanged louder than my thoughts and the kitchen was barely large enough for one person to stand comfortably. I worked 3 jobs while finishing nursing school because scholarships covered tuition but not rent, groceries, gas, or the endless stack of bills that waited patiently on my counter every month. Coffee had become less of a drink and more of a survival strategy. I poured the cheapest brand I could find into a travel mug, grabbed yesterday's bagel, and headed into another day that already felt too heavy. My morning shift at the senior care center ended just after noon. Most of my patients greeted me with warm smiles that made exhaustion feel worthwhile. Mrs. Dawson insisted on calling me Sunshine because she claimed I smiled even when I looked ready to collapse. I laughed every time she said it, mostly because I didn't want her to know how close she was to being wrong. By 3 o'clock I was changing into my black waitress uniform inside the cramped employee locker room of the Grand Ashford Hotel, one of Manhattan's most exclusive event venues. Tonight was their annual charity gala, the kind of evening where diamonds sparkled brighter than the chandeliers and people donated more money in a single auction than I expected to earn in 5 years. The manager walked down the line inspecting every server like we were decorations instead of people. He stopped in front of me, frowned, and brushed an invisible speck from my shoulder. "Smile more, Emily," he said. "People tip happy faces." I nodded because arguing never improved anyone's paycheck. Around me, the other servers whispered excitedly about celebrities, business moguls, and politicians expected to attend. I wasn't interested in any of them. I only cared about making enough tips to pay next month's electric bill before the overdue notice arrived. As the ballroom lights came alive, reflecting across polished marble and towering windows overlooking the city skyline, I caught my own reflection in one of the mirrored columns. My uniform fit perfectly. My hair was neatly tied back. My makeup barely existed because I couldn't justify spending money on things that disappeared after 12 hours. I looked ordinary. Invisible. Safe. Or at least I thought I was. What I didn't know was that before the night ended, complete strangers would laugh at my humiliation, the wealthiest people in New York would pretend not to see it, and somewhere beyond those gilded doors, the most feared man in the city was about to walk into the same room without realizing that meeting the girl everyone loved to look down on would quietly change both of our lives forever. The ballroom transformed slowly, almost like watching another world assemble itself piece by polished piece. Florists adjusted towering white orchids until every bloom leaned at exactly the right angle. Musicians tuned their instruments beneath a ceiling covered in crystal chandeliers that scattered warm light across the marble floor like tiny stars. Hotel staff moved with rehearsed precision, smoothing tablecloths that probably cost more than my monthly rent and placing handwritten name cards beside plates trimmed with real gold. I balanced a silver tray against my hip while helping another waitress polish champagne flutes until they gleamed without a single fingerprint. Around me, everyone spoke in hushed voices, as though the guests arriving tonight deserved silence itself. At exactly 6 o'clock the first black luxury sedans rolled beneath the grand entrance canopy. Valets hurried forward. Cameras flashed from behind velvet ropes. Couples stepped out wearing gowns that floated like liquid silk and tuxedos tailored so perfectly they looked sculpted instead of sewn. Diamonds caught the light with every movement. Expensive perfume drifted through the air before many of the guests even reached the ballroom doors. I watched them smile effortlessly, greeting one another by first name, discussing vacation homes in Aspen, charity boards, investment portfolios, and children attending schools I had only read about online. It was not jealousy that filled me. It was curiosity. I wondered what it felt like to move through life without calculating the price of every decision. A single handbag resting casually on one woman's shoulder probably equaled every paycheck I had earned that year. I quietly reminded myself that comparison had never paid a bill. My section included several VIP tables near the ballroom center where executives, politicians, and philanthropists would be seated. The event coordinator handed me a seating chart before giving one final warning. Smile. Stay invisible. Never interrupt a conversation unless spoken to directly. The words landed harder than she probably intended. Invisible. Somehow that part came naturally. As more guests filled the room, conversations blended into one constant wave of laughter and polite applause. I carried tray after tray through narrow openings between tables, offering champagne with practiced confidence even while my feet already ached inside shoes that had survived far too many double shifts. Most people accepted a glass without looking at my face. Some reached toward the tray while continuing conversations as though I were another piece of furniture. A few thanked me with distracted smiles. Those small moments of kindness mattered more than they would ever know. Near the grand staircase, I noticed a young employee struggling to carry an oversized arrangement of fresh flowers. One vase tilted dangerously. I set my tray onto a nearby service station and hurried over before anyone noticed. Together we steadied the arrangement, preventing several $100s worth of glass and flowers from crashing onto the polished floor. She whispered a grateful thank you before disappearing toward the kitchen. No one else seemed to notice either of us. That was all right. Sometimes doing the right thing only needed one witness, even if that witness was yourself. By 7 o'clock every seat appeared occupied. The string quartet began playing softly as the master of ceremonies welcomed the city's most generous donors. Applause echoed through the ballroom while I stepped quietly between tables refilling water glasses and collecting empty plates. Then I heard someone behind me chuckle just loudly enough to carry. They really hire anyone these days. Another voice answered with quiet amusement. Just do not let her spill anything near our table. Their laughter blended into the music, but every word found its mark. I kept walking without turning around, reminding myself that pride could not be deposited into a bank account. Still, somewhere deep inside, a small part of me wondered how much longer a person could keep pretending those words did not hurt. The comments followed me from table to table like invisible threads I could not quite shake loose. Most guests never looked directly at me, but every now and then I caught fragments of conversations that reminded me exactly where I stood in their world. One woman wrinkled her nose because I refilled her water before she had asked. Another sighed dramatically when I apologized for reaching across the table to collect an empty plate. None of it was enough to ruin the evening, but together the tiny moments settled on my shoulders like invisible weight. I reminded myself that I had survived harder days than this. 4 more hours. That was all I needed. Then I could go home, wash away the perfume and polished smiles, and study for Monday's pharmacology exam. The ballroom buzzed with effortless confidence while I quietly slipped between conversations that were never meant to include someone like me. As I approached one of the center tables carrying fresh champagne, a woman wearing an emerald evening gown glanced at my name tag before exchanging a knowing smile with the man beside her. Emily, she said sweetly enough to make me stop. Would you be a dear and make certain none of the glasses are chipped? We would hate for this event to look inexpensive. Her friends chuckled softly. I lowered my eyes to the tray, inspected each glass with care, and answered exactly the way the hotel trained us to respond. Of course, ma'am. Everything has been checked, but I will gladly inspect them again. She tilted her head with theatrical sympathy. That is good. Attention to detail is important in your line of work. The sentence sounded harmless on its own, yet everyone at the table smiled in a way that made its meaning unmistakable. I simply nodded and continued serving. My heartbeat stayed steady, but my fingers tightened slightly beneath the silver tray. A few minutes later another guest raised his hand without looking at me. Mississippi. I stepped forward. Yes, sir? He pointed toward an empty champagne flute. This has been empty for nearly 60 seconds. The people around him laughed as though he had delivered the evening's funniest joke. I smiled politely, poured another glass, wished everyone an enjoyable evening, and walked away before anyone could see the warmth gathering behind my eyes. Crying had never solved anything. Besides, mascara was expensive. Near the service station, my coworker Lily touched my elbow. "Are you all right?" she whispered. I forced a small smile. "Just tired." She looked unconvinced but nodded before hurrying back toward another table. I appreciated that she asked. Sometimes concern arrived quietly, asking for nothing in return. The orchestra shifted into another elegant melody while the charity auction prepared to begin. Guests settled into their seats, conversations softened, and I carried one final tray of sparkling water toward the front of the ballroom. Halfway across the room, one of the guests stepped backward without checking behind him. His shoulder brushed mine just enough to upset my balance. The tray dipped slightly before I caught it with both hands, preventing every glass from falling. Relief barely had time to settle before the man frowned at me as though the entire thing had been my fault. "Watch where you are going," he said loudly enough for nearby tables to hear. Several people turned toward us. Heat rushed into my face. I opened my mouth to apologize even though I knew I had done nothing wrong. Before the words could leave my lips, the ballroom entrance fell strangely quiet. It was not announced. It was not planned. It simply happened, as if an unseen current had swept through the room. Conversations stopped one by one. Heads turned toward the massive doors. Even the musicians hesitated for a single heartbeat. Whoever had just arrived did not need an introduction because everyone else had already given him one with their silence. The silence spread through the ballroom with astonishing speed, rolling from one table to the next until even the clinking of silverware seemed to disappear. I followed everyone else's gaze toward the entrance, expecting a famous actor or perhaps a politician. Instead, I saw a man who carried himself with the kind of quiet confidence that made introductions unnecessary. He looked to be in his early 30s, tall, broad-shouldered, dressed in a perfectly tailored charcoal suit that somehow managed to appear understated despite its obvious quality. His dark hair was neatly combed back, revealing sharp features that belonged on the cover of a magazine rather than in a room filled with people twice his age. His blue eyes moved across the ballroom with calm precision, never lingering long enough to appear curious yet somehow noticing everything. 3 men in equally tailored suits walked a respectful distance behind him, not surrounding him but following naturally, as though years of habit had taught them exactly where they belonged. Nobody rushed to greet him. Instead, people waited for him to decide whom he wished to acknowledge first. The atmosphere shifted in ways I could not explain. Earlier, guests had laughed loudly and competed for attention. Now conversations became measured. Smiles turned careful. Even those who carried themselves with effortless authority seemed eager not to make mistakes. I leaned quietly toward Lily, who stood beside the service station pretending to straighten folded napkins. "Who is he?" I whispered. Her eyes widened slightly before she answered without looking away from the entrance. "That is Adrian Romano." The name meant absolutely nothing to me. My confused expression must have shown because Lily looked at me as though I had admitted I had never heard of New York City. "You seriously do not know who he is," she whispered. I shook my head. She lowered her voice even further. "Just stay professional. That is all you need to know." Before I could ask another question, the hotel manager hurried across the ballroom so quickly that I almost laughed. I had never seen him move with such urgency. He greeted Adrian with both hands extended and a smile far warmer than any employee had received all evening. Adrian returned the greeting with a polite nod, his expression calm, respectful, and surprisingly reserved. There was nothing theatrical about him. He did not demand attention. Somehow he attracted it without trying. As he made his way toward the reserved table near the front, guests greeted him one after another. Some offered handshakes. Others simply nodded. I noticed something unusual. No one interrupted him. No one spoke over him. They waited. They listened. Then they stepped aside. It was the opposite of everything I had witnessed since arriving. The event coordinator hurried toward me carrying another tray. "Emily, table 1 needs sparkling water immediately." I accepted the tray with a quiet yes and made my way toward the very table where Adrian had just taken his seat. My heartbeat remained steady. To me he was simply another guest, perhaps wealthier than most, perhaps more influential, but still someone attending the same fundraiser as everyone else. As I approached, I carefully poured water into each crystal glass without drawing attention to myself. Adrian was listening while another guest discussed a children's medical foundation. He thanked the speaker, asked thoughtful questions, and never once checked his phone or looked distracted. His voice was calm, measured, almost unexpectedly gentle. When I reached his place setting, I carefully filled his glass. For the briefest moment, his eyes lifted from the conversation and met mine. There was no smile. No frown. No judgment. Just one quiet glance before he thanked me with 2 simple words. "Thank you." I answered automatically. "You are welcome, sir." Then I moved on, never imagining that within the next hour those same eyes would witness something neither of us would ever forget. For the next 40 minutes I barely thought about Adrian Romano again. The ballroom settled back into its familiar rhythm, and I became part of the background once more, moving from table to table with practiced efficiency. Empty glasses disappeared. Fresh drinks appeared. Dinner plates replaced salad forks with quiet precision. It was the kind of work that rewarded people for never being noticed. Still, every now and then, I felt an unexpected awareness settle over me. It was not uncomfortable exactly. It simply felt as though someone had quietly taken notice of details everyone else overlooked. I brushed the feeling aside each time. There were hundreds of people in the ballroom. I was imagining things. At one point an elderly gentleman accidentally dropped his napkin beneath the table. Before any of the guests around him reacted, I crouched down, retrieved it, and quietly offered him a clean replacement. He smiled warmly. "Thank you, young lady." His kindness lingered with me long after I walked away. Small moments like that reminded me why I still believed people were capable of goodness. As I returned toward the service station, I noticed Adrian speaking with the chairman of the Children's Foundation. He listened far more than he talked. While others around the table seemed eager to impress one another with stories of donations and business accomplishments, he asked questions about hospital equipment, scholarship programs, and pediatric care. His attention appeared genuine rather than performative. It surprised me. I had expected another wealthy executive eager to hear himself speak. Instead, he seemed more interested in listening. Lily brushed past me carrying dessert plates. "Have you noticed?" she whispered. "Noticed what?" "He keeps watching the room." I glanced toward table 1. Adrian was not looking at me. He was quietly observing the ballroom, almost as though he were reading the atmosphere instead of simply attending the gala. Every few moments his eyes drifted across the guests, the staff, the musicians, even the security personnel stationed near the exits. Nothing about his expression suggested suspicion. It was simply awareness. "Maybe he is just paying attention," I answered. Lily shook her head. "People like him always notice more than everyone else." Before I could ask what she meant, the dessert service began. I carefully balanced a tray of miniature cheesecakes, chocolate mousse, and fresh berries before weaving between crowded tables. The ballroom lights had dimmed slightly, leaving the chandeliers to cast a warmer golden glow across smiling faces and sparkling crystal. Laughter returned as auction winners celebrated their successful bids. The tension that had accompanied Adrian's arrival seemed to have softened. Even so, I noticed one difference. Whenever guests approached his table, they straightened their jackets, lowered their voices, and measured every word. Respect surrounded him as naturally as light surrounded the chandeliers overhead. As I reached another VIP table, one of the guests snapped his fingers to get my attention without bothering to look up from his conversation. I walked over with the same polite smile I had worn all evening. "May I help you, sir?" He pointed lazily toward a dessert spoon resting beside his plate. "This one has a fingerprint." I examined it carefully. The polished silver reflected the ballroom lights perfectly. There was no fingerprint. Even so, I quietly replaced it with another spoon. "My apologies." He smiled with quiet satisfaction, as though making someone else feel smaller somehow made him taller. I turned to leave, keeping my posture steady despite the familiar sting in my chest. Across the ballroom, Adrian happened to lift his eyes at that exact moment. Our gazes met for only an instant before I looked away, but something about his expression had changed. He was no longer simply observing the room. Somehow, without either of us speaking a single word, I had the unmistakable feeling that he had begun observing me. I tried to convince myself I had imagined the look in Adrian Romano's eyes, but the feeling stayed with me as the evening moved toward its final program. It was easier to believe I was simply exhausted. 16 hours on my feet had a way of making ordinary moments feel unusually important. I picked up another silver tray loaded with crystal champagne flutes and followed the route I had walked at least 20 times already. The orchestra played softly in the background while conversations drifted through the ballroom like overlapping waves. Somewhere near the stage, the host announced another generous donation, earning a round of applause that echoed beneath the chandeliers. I smiled politely as guests accepted fresh glasses, thanking those who bothered to acknowledge me and quietly serving those who did not. My attention stayed on the tray balanced carefully in my hands. One careless step could undo an entire evening of hard work. As I approached the center tables, I noticed the same man who had complained about the fingerprint on his dessert spoon. He stood surrounded by several well-dressed friends, laughing loudly while holding an untouched glass of champagne. I slowed slightly to give them room to pass. Instead of moving aside, he stepped directly into my path with an exaggerated flourish, forcing me to stop. "Another refill," he said without looking at me. I offered the tray. He reached for a glass, then paused, studying my face with amused curiosity. "You have been working all night," he said. "Do they ever let you people rest?" His friends laughed quietly. I answered with the same calm professionalism that had carried me through the evening. "We are happy to help make the event successful, sir." He smirked. "That sounds rehearsed." Before I could respond, he turned slightly as though preparing to leave. His elbow brushed against the edge of my tray. The movement was small, almost impossible to prove intentional, but it shifted the balance just enough. I reacted instantly, grabbing the tray with both hands before the glasses could fall. A few drops of champagne splashed onto the polished marble floor and onto the sleeve of his expensive jacket. The room around us seemed to pause. The man stared at the tiny droplets on his cuff as though they were permanent stains. He sighed dramatically before raising his voice just enough for nearby tables to hear. "Unbelievable. Do they train anyone anymore?" A few guests looked over. Someone chuckled. Another person shook his head with exaggerated disappointment. I felt every pair of curious eyes settling on me again. "I am very sorry, sir," I said quietly. "I will have someone bring you a fresh napkin immediately." He looked at me for another second before taking the napkin I offered. "Maybe next time pay attention instead of daydreaming." More laughter followed, louder this time. My cheeks grew warm, but I refused to argue. I refused to let frustration show on my face. Instead, I lowered my eyes, steadied the tray once more, and took a slow breath. There was dignity in remaining calm, even when no one else valued it. I turned to continue serving the next table as though nothing had happened. The ballroom gradually returned to its conversations, convinced the moment was already over. It was not. Across the room, beyond the cluster of smiling donors and glittering crystal, Adrian Romano had witnessed every second. He had not interrupted. He had not spoken. He had simply watched in complete silence, his expression unreadable, his blue eyes fixed not on the guest who mocked me, but on the way I chose to answer humiliation with quiet grace. My hands remained steady even after I walked away, but my heartbeat refused to slow. I focused on the simple rhythm that had carried me through countless difficult shifts before. Pick up an empty glass. Replace a napkin. Refill the water. Smile. Breathe. Repeat. If I kept moving, perhaps the embarrassment would fade into another story I would eventually laugh about. Around me, the ballroom gradually returned to its elegant routine. Conversations resumed. Silverware clinked softly against china. The orchestra filled the room with another gentle melody. To everyone else, the awkward exchange had already been forgotten. At least that was what I wanted to believe. I stopped beside the service station to exchange my half-empty tray for a fresh one when the event coordinator hurried past, whispering instructions into a headset. Across the ballroom, several important guests had gathered around Adrian Romano's table, each waiting patiently for an opportunity to speak with him. Even from a distance, I noticed something different. Adrian was no longer engaged in conversation. He had set his glass down untouched. His eyes remained fixed across the room in my direction. Not with curiosity. Not with sympathy. With quiet certainty. Before I could think anything more of it, the same guest from earlier laughed loudly again while speaking to his friends. He lifted his champagne glass as though reenacting what had just happened. Perhaps next year they can hire professionals, he joked. Another burst of polite laughter followed. Then something unexpected happened. A chair slid backward across polished marble. The sound itself was not loud, but it carried through the ballroom with surprising clarity. Every nearby conversation paused. Adrian Romano rose from his seat with calm, unhurried movements. No dramatic gesture. No visible anger. He simply adjusted the front of his suit jacket and began walking. His three associates instinctively stepped aside rather than beside him. The guests standing nearby moved first. Then those farther away noticed and did the same. A narrow path opened naturally through the ballroom without anyone being asked. I stood frozen beside the service station, unsure whether I should continue working or disappear into the kitchen. Adrian walked directly toward the center of the room where the laughing group still stood. The smiling expressions around them slowly faded as they realized who was approaching. The man who had mocked me straightened his posture immediately. "Mr. Romano," he said with an eager smile. "It is good to see you again." Adrian acknowledged the greeting with a slight nod but did not stop walking. He glanced briefly at the damp champagne stain that had already dried on the man's sleeve before lifting his eyes again. His voice, when he finally spoke, was calm enough that people several tables away leaned closer to hear. "I have a question." The ballroom fell completely silent. The man smiled uncertainly. "Of course." Adrian looked at him without the slightest change in expression. "Did that young woman apologize to you?" The man blinked. "Well, yes." Adrian gave one slow nod. "Did she replace your napkin?" "Yes." "Did she offer to correct the mistake immediately?" "Yes." Adrian let the silence stretch another few seconds before asking his final question. "Then why did you continue trying to embarrass someone who had already treated you with more respect than you offered her?" No one laughed this time. No one looked at me anymore. Every eye in the ballroom settled on the guest whose confident smile had quietly disappeared. For the first time all evening, the room was no longer watching the waitress. It was waiting to hear the answer of the man who suddenly seemed far smaller than the person standing calmly in front of him. The man opened his mouth twice before any words came out. "I did not mean anything by it," he said with an uneasy laugh that no one joined. "It was only a joke." Adrian Romano remained perfectly still. He did not raise his voice. He did not take another step forward. Somehow that quiet composure carried more weight than any display of anger could have. "A joke," he repeated calmly. "Those are usually funny for everyone involved." The silence that followed felt almost tangible. Around the ballroom, people who had been smiling only moments earlier now studied their glasses, their napkins, or the polished floor beneath their shoes. No one seemed eager to become part of the conversation. Adrian glanced briefly around the surrounding tables before returning his attention to the guest. Tell me, he continued, if someone spoke to your daughter the way you spoke to that young woman tonight, would you still call it a joke? The man's expression faltered. He looked around as though searching for support, but none of his companions offered any. One quietly cleared his throat. Another suddenly became fascinated by the dessert menu lying unopened beside his plate. No, the man admitted after a long pause. Probably not. Adrian gave one slow nod. Then perhaps the problem is not your sense of humor. Perhaps it is your habit of forgetting that respect should never depend on someone's job title. The words settled over the room with remarkable force. There was nothing dramatic about them, yet they seemed to reach every corner of the ballroom. I stood frozen near the service station, still holding my tray, almost unable to believe the conversation was happening because of me. Adrian finally turned his head slightly toward the hotel manager, who had hurried over without making a sound. May I ask you something? Adrian said politely. Of course, Mr. Romano, the manager answered immediately. Has Miss Carter performed her duties professionally this evening? The manager nodded without hesitation. She has been one of our best employees tonight. Adrian asked another question. Has she been respectful to every guest? Absolutely. Has anyone reported misconduct on her part? No, sir. Adrian looked back toward the man standing before him. Then we have established something important. She fulfilled her responsibilities with professionalism. You chose not to fulfill yours. Another long silence followed before Adrian spoke again, his tone as measured as ever. I believe an apology is appropriate. The guest swallowed visibly. For the first time that evening, confidence abandoned him completely. Slowly, he turned toward me. Every eye in the ballroom followed. I wished they would not. I wished I could disappear. Instead, I found myself meeting his gaze. Miss Carter, he said quietly, I owe you an apology. I was discourteous. You handled yourself with far more grace than I deserved. I am sorry. The words sounded genuine, perhaps because they had become unavoidable. Adrian said nothing. He simply waited. One after another, the guests who had laughed earlier exchanged uncomfortable glances before murmuring apologies of their own. Some looked embarrassed. Others looked thoughtful. A few could barely meet my eyes. I did not know what to say. My voice almost failed me before I finally managed a quiet response. Thank you. I hope you enjoy the rest of your evening. That was all. No speech. No triumph. Just the same courtesy I had offered from the beginning. As conversation slowly returned throughout the ballroom, something subtle had changed forever. Earlier that evening I had been invisible. Now every person in that room had witnessed a simple truth. Respect was not measured by wealth, influence, or expensive clothing. Sometimes it was measured by the person who remained kind after every reason to become bitter. And as Adrian Romano quietly returned to his table without another word, I could not understand why the most powerful man in the room had chosen to defend the least important person in it. The applause never came. Somehow that made the moment feel even more real. One by one, conversations resumed, but they returned in quieter voices than before, as though everyone had silently agreed that something important had happened without ever appearing on the evening's schedule. I remained standing exactly where I was for several seconds, my fingers still wrapped around the silver tray while my mind struggled to catch up with reality. No one had ever stood up for me like that. Not a teacher. Not a manager. Not even people who had known me for years. Yet a man whose name I had learned less than an hour earlier had interrupted one of the most prestigious charity galas in New York simply because he believed someone should be treated with basic respect. It did not make sense. I finally forced my feet to move, returning to my duties before anyone could accuse me of lingering. The hotel manager intercepted me near the service station. Instead of the usual hurried instructions, he offered an awkward smile. Emily, you handled yourself exceptionally well tonight. I thanked him quietly, although part of me wondered why those words had never been spoken before someone influential had witnessed my work. Lily hurried over moments later, her eyes impossibly wide. "Do you have any idea what just happened?" she whispered. I shook my head. "Neither do I." She looked toward Adrian's table before lowering her voice even further. "People spend years trying to get his attention. Tonight he spent it on you." I let out a nervous laugh. "Only because I embarrassed myself." Lily immediately shook her head. "No. Because you did not." Before I could answer, another tray was placed into my hands. The evening was not over yet. Guests were beginning to prepare for coffee service, and routines returned with comforting familiarity. Cups were filled. Desserts were cleared. Chairs shifted softly across marble. Yet something invisible had changed. The same guests who had ignored me earlier now looked directly at me when speaking. Several thanked me by name after reading the small badge pinned neatly to my uniform. One elderly woman smiled warmly before saying, "You carry yourself with remarkable grace." I thanked her, unsure how to respond to compliments that had appeared so suddenly. Near the ballroom entrance, I noticed Adrian preparing to leave. His associates were already waiting a respectful distance away while several guests attempted brief conversations before he departed. Every interaction remained calm, measured, and surprisingly ordinary despite the quiet influence that surrounded him. I watched for only a moment before looking away. Whatever had happened tonight was finished. Our worlds were far too different to cross again. As I gathered empty coffee cups from the final table, I heard measured footsteps approach. I turned, expecting another guest requesting service. Instead, Adrian stood a few feet away, his expression as composed as ever. The ballroom seemed to soften around us, though no one openly stared. "Miss Carter," he said politely. "May I have a moment?" I carefully set the tray onto the service station. "Of course, sir." He regarded me quietly for a second before speaking. "You showed remarkable composure this evening." I offered a small smile. "Thank you." He nodded once, as though expecting a longer answer that never came. Most people would have responded differently. I met his eyes for the first time without immediately looking away. "Respectfully, Mr. Romano, I did not stay calm because I am stronger than anyone else." He listened without interruption. "I stayed calm because losing my dignity would have given them exactly what they wanted." Something unreadable flickered across his face. Perhaps surprise. Perhaps admiration. I continued before I could lose my courage. "And while I appreciate what you did for me tonight, I do not want anyone to believe I need powerful people to prove that I deserve respect. I deserved it before you stood up. They simply chose not to see it." For the first time all evening, Adrian Romano did not answer immediately. He simply looked at me with an expression I had not seen before, as though the woman everyone else overlooked had just taught him something no one else ever had. Adrian did not respond right away. He simply held my gaze for another quiet moment before a faint smile touched the corner of his mouth, so subtle I almost wondered if I had imagined it. "Perhaps you are right," he said at last. "Respect should never require someone else's permission." He inclined his head slightly, a gesture that felt less like a farewell and more like genuine acknowledgement. "Thank you for reminding me of that." With those words, he turned and walked toward the ballroom entrance where his associates were already waiting. No dramatic exit followed. No crowd gathered around him. Yet every person he passed instinctively stepped aside, creating the same silent path that had welcomed him earlier. I watched him disappear through the grand doors before realizing I had been standing still for far too long. The rest of the evening passed in a blur of coffee cups, folded linens, and exhausted smiles. By midnight the ballroom looked almost unrecognizable. The flowers remained beautiful, but the tables were half empty. The music had stopped. Guests drifted toward waiting cars while hotel employees quietly erased every sign that hundreds of people had celebrated there only hours before. I changed out of my uniform inside the locker room, pulled on my old denim jacket, and rubbed my aching feet before beginning the subway ride home. The city outside felt strangely peaceful. Manhattan shimmered beneath thousands of lights while the train rattled steadily beneath the streets. I replayed the evening over and over, still unable to understand why any of it had happened. By the time I unlocked the door to my apartment, it was nearly 1:30 in the morning. My tiny studio welcomed me with familiar silence and the gentle clanking of the old radiator. I dropped my backpack onto the chair, microwaved leftover soup, and opened my pharmacology textbook even though my eyes struggled to stay focused. Life did not pause simply because something extraordinary had happened. Tuition was still due. Rent still waited. My alarm would still ring before sunrise. The next morning arrived far too quickly. I returned to the senior care center carrying the same travel mug filled with inexpensive coffee and wearing the same comfortable sneakers that had carried me through countless shifts. Mrs. Dawson greeted me with her usual bright smile. "Good morning, sunshine. You look tired." I laughed softly. "That seems to be becoming my permanent condition." She patted my hand affectionately. "Keep that smile. The world needs more of it." Her words stayed with me long after breakfast rounds ended. Over the next several days something unexpected began happening. Little inconveniences that had quietly followed me for months started disappearing one by one. The broken vending machine outside the nursing classrooms suddenly worked again after sitting out of service for weeks. An anonymous donor paid for new simulation equipment at the nursing program, allowing students to borrow supplies without additional fees. My landlord, who rarely smiled, informed every tenant that the building's unreliable heating system was finally being replaced earlier than expected. None of those things seemed connected. They simply felt like fortunate coincidences arriving all at once. I never considered looking for patterns because life had taught me not to expect miracles. Late Friday afternoon, after finishing class, I stopped by the campus financial aid office to submit another scholarship application. The receptionist searched my student file before looking up with visible confusion. "Miss Carter," she said, "according to our records, your remaining tuition balance for this semester has already been paid in full." I stared at her, convinced she had opened the wrong account. "There has to be some mistake." She checked the screen again before slowly shaking her head. "No mistake. The payment cleared yesterday morning." I walked back onto the campus sidewalk carrying the same worn backpack but feeling as though the ground beneath my feet had quietly shifted, because I knew with absolute certainty that I had not paid that bill. For the rest of the afternoon I convinced myself there had to be a clerical error. Colleges did not simply erase tuition balances without explanation, especially not for students like me. I visited the bursar's office next. Then financial aid. Then the scholarship department. Every answer remained exactly the same. The payment had been processed through a private donor account with instructions to remain anonymous. I asked whether they could at least tell me if it had come from a foundation. The administrator offered an apologetic smile before shaking her head. The donor specifically requested complete confidentiality. I thanked her and walked outside with more questions than answers. Autumn had begun settling over the city. A cool breeze carried golden leaves across the campus sidewalks while students hurried between classes discussing exams, weekend plans, and football games. Normally I would have appreciated the peaceful afternoon. Instead, my thoughts kept circling the same impossible question. Why me? I had never asked anyone for special treatment. That evening I stopped by the diner where I worked weekend breakfast shifts. My manager waved me into his office before I had even tied on my apron. "Good news," he said with an unusually cheerful grin. A customer left a generous appreciation fund for the staff after Sunday's breakfast service. We decided to divide it equally, but there was one request. Whoever donated asked that you receive the largest share because they admired your work ethic. He handed me an envelope. I stared at it without opening it. "Did they leave a name?" He shook his head. "No. Just a note." I unfolded the small card inside. It contained only one sentence written in neat handwriting. "Hard work deserves opportunity." No signature. No explanation. A strange feeling settled over me. The words sounded familiar somehow, though I could not remember why. By the time my shift ended, I had almost convinced myself life was simply balancing the scales after years of struggle. That illusion lasted until Sunday afternoon when Lily called unexpectedly. "Emily, have you seen the news?" she asked. "No. I have been studying all day." "Turn on Channel 8. Curiosity overcame me. I switched on the old television sitting across from my couch just as the evening news began covering a charity event downtown. The story quickly shifted to local business leaders who had funded several children's hospitals and educational programs across New York. A familiar face appeared on the screen. Adrian Romano stood beside hospital administrators as cameras flashed around him. The reporter described him as a successful investor and philanthropist whose charitable foundation had quietly financed medical research, scholarships, and community clinics for years. I watched silently until the segment ended. It painted the picture of a respected businessman devoted to improving the city. Then another report followed immediately afterward. Different anchor. Different tone. The words caught me completely off guard. Federal investigators continue monitoring alleged organized crime connections involving several influential New York families, including individuals connected through historical business relationships to the Romano organization. No criminal charges have been filed against Adrian Romano, who has repeatedly denied involvement in illegal activity. My breath caught. The screen showed the same composed man I had met at the gala, now surrounded by reporters shouting questions he ignored completely. Two entirely different versions of the same person had appeared within the span of 5 minutes. One dedicated millions to hospitals and scholarships. The other carried a family name whispered whenever people discussed the city's most powerful criminal legends. I turned off the television, but the silence inside my apartment felt louder than the broadcast had been. For the first time since the gala, I wondered whether accepting kindness from someone I barely knew might carry consequences I had never considered. And for reasons I could not explain, I found myself hoping I would never see Adrian Romano again, even as a quiet part of me suspected that hope had already arrived too late. The next week unfolded with an uneasy calm that never quite allowed me to relax. I buried myself in nursing classes, double shifts, and study sessions, hoping routine would silence the questions constantly circling my mind. It almost worked. Almost. Then, on Thursday evening, my clinical rotation at Midtown Community Hospital ended later than expected. The autumn sky had already turned dark, and a steady rain painted the sidewalks with shimmering reflections from passing traffic. I pulled my hood over my head and started the familiar 6-block walk toward the subway station, my backpack growing heavier with every step. The streets were still busy, but something felt strangely different. Twice I noticed the same black sedan parked along my route. It could have been a coincidence. New York was full of black sedans. Still, the uneasy feeling refused to disappear. By the time I reached the subway entrance, a well-dressed man stepped into my path with an apologetic smile. He looked to be in his 40s, carrying himself with the polished confidence of someone accustomed to expensive boardrooms. "Miss Carter?" he asked politely. I hesitated before answering. "Yes?" "I represent a private foundation interested in supporting exceptional nursing students. We would appreciate a few minutes of your time." Every instinct told me to decline. "I am sorry, but I have a train to catch." His smile never changed. "This concerns Adrian Romano." Hearing that name stopped me for only a second. "Then I am even less interested." I stepped around him and continued toward the station. He did not follow. Instead, he spoke calmly enough for me to hear over the rain. "Mr. Romano has many admirers. He also has people who dislike seeing him help others." I kept walking without looking back. The words stayed with me all the way home. 2 days later, another strange incident occurred. Someone arrived at the senior care center asking specifically for me. The receptionist informed them that employees could not receive unexpected visitors during working hours, so the individual left a sealed envelope instead. Inside was a single photograph from the charity gala. It showed Adrian speaking to the guest who had apologized to me while I stood quietly in the background holding my serving tray. Nothing threatening. Nothing inappropriate. Yet one sentence typed beneath the picture sent a chill through me. You have become more important than you realize. There was no signature. No return address. I immediately reported the envelope to my supervisor, who suggested it was probably an unpleasant prank. I wanted to believe her. That evening, as I left work, I noticed the same black sedan parked across the street. Before anxiety could convince me to turn around, another vehicle pulled quietly to the curb beside me. The passenger window lowered halfway. I recognized the driver immediately. He was one of the men who had accompanied Adrian at the gala. "Miss Carter," he said respectfully. "Mr. Romano asked me to deliver a message." I remained on the sidewalk without moving closer. "What message?" "He requests that you avoid traveling alone for the next few days." My pulse quickened. "Why?" The driver answered honestly. "Because someone has mistaken your kindness for a weakness they can use." Before I could ask another question, a second car farther down the block suddenly pulled away from the curb and disappeared into afternoon traffic. The driver watched it for a moment before looking back at me. "Mr. Romano hoped this would never involve you." I tightened my grip on my backpack. "I never asked to be involved." He nodded with genuine understanding. "We know." For several long seconds neither of us spoke. Finally, he handed me a simple business card containing only a phone number and Adrian Romano's name. "If anything unusual happens," he said quietly, "do not ignore it." He drove away without another word, leaving me alone on the crowded sidewalk holding a card I never wanted to need, while somewhere in the city I could not shake the feeling that forces I barely understood had already begun quietly closing in around both of us. I stared at the business card for a long time before slipping it into the smallest pocket of my backpack, silently hoping it would remain there forever. Life, however, rarely asks what we hope for. The following Monday morning, I arrived at the senior care center expecting another ordinary shift. Mrs. Dawson greeted me with her familiar smile, teasing that I looked less exhausted than usual. We laughed together while I helped her arrange fresh flowers on the windowsill. For a few peaceful hours, the outside world disappeared. There were medications to organize, patients to comfort, and stories to hear from people who measured wealth in memories rather than bank accounts. Then my supervisor called me into her office. A man had arrived asking for me, she explained, but after being informed that visitors were not permitted, he had simply thanked the receptionist and walked away without leaving his name. Something about the encounter unsettled her enough to notify building security. I remembered the business card. My hand instinctively found the pocket where I had hidden it. For several minutes I argued with myself before finally making the call. The phone rang only once. "Miss Carter," a calm voice answered immediately. It was Adrian. "I was hoping you would never need this number." I closed my eyes for a brief moment. "Someone has been looking for me again." He remained silent until I finished explaining everything. When I finally stopped speaking, his answer came without hesitation. "You have done nothing wrong. Someone believes they can reach me through you because they misunderstand the kind of man I am." I frowned. "Can they?" Another pause followed before he answered honestly. "No. They misunderstand the kind of woman you are." Those words stayed with me long after the call ended. The days that followed were unexpectedly quiet. The strange cars disappeared. No more anonymous envelopes arrived. No unfamiliar visitors asked for me. Whatever misunderstanding had begun seemed to fade as suddenly as it had appeared. Several weeks later I received my white nursing pin during a small ceremony at school. My classmates celebrated with family and friends while I searched the audience, smiling when I spotted Mrs. Dawson sitting proudly in the second row after insisting she would never miss my special day. As the ceremony ended, the dean announced one final surprise. A newly established scholarship fund would support future nursing students who demonstrated exceptional compassion toward patients regardless of their background or financial circumstances. The program had been created by an anonymous benefactor who requested only one condition. The scholarship would forever carry a simple inscription. Respect is the beginning of every kind of healing. I did not need anyone to tell me whose words those were. Outside the auditorium, autumn sunlight warmed the stone steps as graduates posed for photographs with their families. Across the street, a familiar black sedan waited quietly beside the curb. Adrian stood beside it wearing another perfectly tailored suit, looking no different than he had on the night we first met. This time there were no grand ballrooms, no expensive chandeliers, and no audience waiting to see what he would do. He simply offered a small congratulatory smile. "Congratulations, Nurse Carter." I smiled back. "Thank you." Neither of us crossed the street. Neither of us tried to change who the other was. Somehow that made the moment feel more honest. After a quiet nod, he stepped into the waiting car and disappeared into the flow of New York traffic. I watched until the sedan became just another vehicle among thousands. People often believe that someone powerful changes another person's life by giving them money, influence, or opportunity. They are wrong. The greatest gift anyone ever gave me was far simpler. On a night when the world decided I was invisible, one man reminded everyone to look at me as a human being first. He never gave me my worth because it had always belonged to me. He simply refused to let anyone else pretend they could take it away.